Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's analyze the essay Gender Trouble, Feminism and a Subversion of Identity, written by Judith Butler. Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, 1990. Judith Butler, born in 1956. The essay belongs under the categories of gender studies, queer theory, post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, and a political theory. The essay emerged during the third wave of feminism and a post-structuralist rethinking of identity categories. It builds on thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, and Beauvoir, questioning the assumptions behind gender and sex binaries. Now the central premise, gender is performative, not a natural stable identity. There is no essential woman or man. These are social constructs created by repeated cultural performances. Sex itself is not purely biological, but a discursive category that is constructed through language, norms, and power structures. The heterosexual matrix is a regulatory grid that normalizes gender as binary and sexuality as heterosexual. Now let's go to the detailed summary. The preface, 1990-1999. Here Judith Butler lays out her motivation, that is to challenge feminism's reliance on a unified category of woman. She critiques the notion that identity categories are politically innocent and insists on troubling the concept of gender. She argues that feminism must radically critique the categories it seeks to represent. Chapter 1. Subjects of Sex, Gender, Desire. Judith Butler questions how gendered subjects are formed. Feminist theory has often assumed that there is a subject, that is woman, whose interests feminism must represent. Drawing on Foucault, Butler argues that subjects are constructed through discourses. Identity is not a pre-existing event. Butler begins to dismantle the sex-gender binary and shows that both are culturally constructed through language and norms. The key idea in chapter first is that there is no pre-discursive subject. Subjects come into being through normative discourses and power. Now chapter second, prohibition, psychoanalysis, and the production of the heterosexual matrix. Butler integrates Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis to explain how gender identity develops through prohibitions and taboos, especially concerning desire. She critiques the heterosexual matrix, that is, a cultural framework that enforces the alignment of sex into female or male, then gender, that is man, woman, and a desire, that is heterosexual. She highlights how the law of the father, as proposed by Lacan, enforces heterosexual norms through language and the symbolic order. She introduces the idea that gender is a cultured fiction maintained by compulsory heterosexuality and institutionalized norms. The key idea in chapter 2 is that gender coherence, that is a man being masculine and a heterosexual, is maintained by social and a linguistic regulation. Now moving on to chapter 3, that is subversive bodily acts. This chapter is the core of Butler's performativity theory. Gender is not a stable event, but a set of stylized repetitions of facts, gestures, and a language that is solidified into the appearance of substance. Subversive acts like a drag expose the performative nature of gender revealing that it is not tied to a biological sex. Such performances parody normative gender roles and open space for resistance and re-signification. The key idea in chapter 3 is that drag is not an imitation of a real gender. It reveals that all gender is imitative. Now let's analyze the key concepts and definitions. First of all, gender performativity. Gender is an act, not an inner truth. This act is reiterative, that is, it is performed over time and it becomes naturalized through repetition. There is no original gender, there are only copies without an original. The next term is heterosexual matrix. There is a cultural framework that aligns biological sex, gender, natural desire, reinforces heteronormativity and marginalizes queer identities. The next idea, that is the illusion of a subject. The subject, that is I, or woman or a man, is not a pre-given entity. Instead, it is produced by discursive regimes and repeated acts of self-identification. The next idea, that is power and discourse. Drawing on Foucault, Butler argues that power does not merely repress but also produces subjects. Language is a regulatory power that reshapes what can be said and who can exist. Now let's analyze the philosophical and theoretical influences for Judith Butler's essay. First of all, Michael Foucault, his subject formation, then power, discourse. The next one, Simone de Beauvoir. One is not born, but it becomes a woman. That is a foundational insight for performativity. The next one, Jacques Derrida. Deconstruction, instability of meaning. The next one, Lacan. That is the symbolic order, law, language and a desire. The next one, Sigmund Freud. Repression, Oedipal complex, sexual development. The next one, Monique Wittig. Lesbian identity, critique of compulsory heterosexuality. The next one, Gail Rubin. Sex gender system theory. Now let's analyze Judith Butler's methodology in the essay. First of all, she draws from deconstruction. She questions the binary distinctions, that is man, woman, sex, gender. Then he uses psychoanalytic techniques. She explores how desire and identity are formed through repression and symbolic structures. Interdisciplinary, where she combines literary theory, philosophy, feminist critique, and politics. Now let's analyze the impact and importance of Judith Butler's essay. She founded queer theory and transformed a feminist theory. She paved the way for discussions around transgender, non-binary and genderqueer identities. She also reshaped the politics of LGBTQ+ activism, identity movements, and academic curricula. Judith Butler's observations are still referenced in debates over pronouns, gender identity in education, and legislation. She inspired further works like Bodies That Matter, published in 1993, and Undoing Gender, 2004, and A Note Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly, 2015. Now let's analyze the criticisms and debates over the essay. First critique, that is abstract language. Critics, for example, Martha Nussbaum, argue that Butler's writing is overly opaque and inaccessible. Political ambiguity. Some feel that Butler undermines political activism by rejecting stable identities. Neglect of material conditions. Marxists and intersectional feminists argue she gives insufficient attention to class, race, and institutional oppression. Judith Butler has addressed some of these criticisms in later works, especially regarding violence, precarity, and embodied vulnerability. Now let's analyze the legacy and relevance of her essay today. Judith Butler's theory is foundational to contemporary gender theory. In law, education, and social policy, her insights help challenge restrictive definitions of gender and identity. Her critique continues to intervene in cultural debates over trans rights, public bathrooms, non-binary identities, and gender performance in media. Her work continues to be adapted into performance studies, film theory, theology, and even neuroscience and affect theory. Now let's analyze the main quotes from her essay. First one, gender is not something that one is. It is something one does, an act, a doing, rather than a being. Butler argues that gender is a performative act that is produced and reproduced through repeated behaviors rather than an innate identity. This challenges the essentialist notion of fixed gender categories. Moving on to the next quote. There is no gender identity behind the expression of gender. Identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. This means that gender identity is created through performance rather than expressing a pre-existing core self. The repeated acts create the illusion of a stable identity. Moving on to the next quote. The heterosexualization of desire works to conceal and normalize what is in fact the imitative structure of gender itself. Judith Butler reveals that heterosexual norms mask the fact that all gender is imitative and constructed. Heteronormativity maintains gender roles by presenting them as natural. Now moving on to the next quote. If the performative constitutes the identity it is purported to express, then the subject is always split between what it aspires to be and the cultural norms that it constitute. This highlights the gap between personal identity and societal expectations, suggesting subjectivity is fragmented by cultural performances. The self is never fully unified or authentic. Moving on to the next quote. The stability of gender identity is a regulatory ideal. Butler here suggests that society enforces gender norms as ideals to maintain order, but these ideals are neither neutral nor inevitable. The enforcement pressures individuals to conform. Now the next quote. Drag becomes a critical tool for exposing the imitative structure of gender itself. Drag performances reveal gender as a copy without an original, subverting the idea of inherent gender. This challenges the binary and fixed nature of gender identities. Now the next quote. The refusal of gender is the refusal of normative power. Rejecting traditional gender roles is also a political act that resists the power structures sustaining those roles. It opens space for alternative identities and freedoms. Now the next quote. Sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Contrary to many feminist and biological assumptions, Butler argues that even the category of sex is shaped by discourse and norms. This breaks down the strict biological biases for gender difference. Now the next quote. Identity categories do not merely describe individuals, but produce those individuals. Labels like man and woman shape and regulate people's identities rather than simply reflecting them. Categories are tools of social control. Now the next quote. The subversive possibility of gender lies in its instability. Gender fluid and a constructed nature allows for resistance and change. Its instability creates opportunities to challenge norms and redefine identity. Now the next quote. Norms not only prohibit but also produce reality. Social norms create the conditions of possibility for what can exist as gendered identity. Power and knowledge work together to shape reality itself. Now the next quote. The subject is a construct of the discourse rather than the origin of discourse. This means that the self is produced through language and a social system, not the other way around. Identity is contingent, not foundational. Now the next quote. Gender is a repetition with a no original. This paradox means gender is an ongoing performance that references no original true gender. The concept of a fixed gender essence is dismantled here. Now the next quote. The political challenge is to re-signify gender. Butler calls for actively redefining gender categories to undermine the power and to open up new possibilities. Changing the meaning of gender is a radical act of resistance. Now the next quote. The very categories of sex and gender are entwined in regulatory regimes of power. Sex and gender are not neutral or natural, but are enforced by social institutions and norms. They function together to maintain hegemonic power structures.